Howdy y'all, my name is Andy King and welcome to King's Comics. Today we are going over Into the Spider-Verse, my review of it, but this time it is my spoiler and Easter egg packed review. For those who are not yet wanting to hear what's in the film or haven't yet seen it, please avoid this video unless you just want to kind of ruin it for yourself or you want to hear my just hot takes on it, my thoughts on it. That being said, I have left a link down below to my spoiler-free review, as well as a little Easter egg down in the description of this video. Either way, please avoid this video if you haven't seen it yet. Get ready, we're about to start the spoiler review. 3, 2, and 1. So, here's what I gotta say. First and foremost, I think this is my favorite Spider-Man movie. I mean, I've said it before in my spoiler-free review that this is just such an ambitious movie, not just for a Spider-Man movie, but for a superhero film. It's animated, it's got multiple Spider-Man in it from different realities, and whenever you start talking about multiverses and different dimensions within comic books or comic book universes, people start to kind of lose track or traction. This is especially true because you'll see or talk to a lot of people who will ask why maybe Batman and Spider-Man aren't seen in the same television show. That's because they're by different publishers. They're by DC and Marvel. Actually, it's kind of hard to explain how that works and then how you have these different universes within universes, if you will. So multiverses are very complicated and very hard to explain in comics. So that being said, let's go ahead and drill down on what I noticed just kind of throughout the movie, because we can go over the 5 Spider-Man, or rather the 6 Spider-Man that we saw. So the first thing I noticed was the fact that the Ultimate Universe canonically is called the Universe 1610. This one is actually the universe that the MCU movies are largely based on. So that's where Thor's design came from. That's where we get Black Nick Fury, which is like the comic version was created to mirror Samuel L. Jackson. So him playing it in Iron Man and the Avengers series is all the better. So I'm really glad he signed up to do that. That being said, the 1610 Ultimate Universe was kind of a reboot for the Marvel Universe they tried to have catch on. That's why you had the Ultimates, which was the Ultimate Universe's version of the Avengers. It was kind of an interesting thought. It just really wasn't necessarily executed well. It was far too edgy. But its author, the guy who kind of penned this and set this whole thing in motion, was Mark Millar. For those of you who may or may not know that name, Mark Millar is the guy who actually wrote Civil War, the original Civil War event comic that the movie Captain America 3 is based on. He also wrote Kick-Ass. For those of you who, I mean the comic Kick-Ass, right? Because there are 3 Kick-Ass graphic novels, 3 Kick-Ass chapters, as well as some different takes, as well as spin-offs. But he's the one who wrote those, and he's written a bunch of others, but he's known, similar to, I'd say, Garth Ennis and Frank Miller, for kind of pushing the envelope with content he delivers. But that being said, he was critical to the development of the MCU as we know it by kind of kickstarting the Marvel 1610 universe. So this is where a lot of the basics came from. I say this because this is where we got a lot of interesting takes on it in this film. Peter Parker is traditionally brown-haired, brown-eyed, so it was interesting seeing a blonde version of him with blue eyes, especially because, and I was actually reading kind of the director's notes, right, in the writer's notes, is they wanted to create this Peter Parker who was as competent of a Peter Parker as Peter Parker, or rather Spider-Man, could be. This is kind of a critical differentiation from the comics because a core element is because Peter had to kind of grow up without an actual father figure, as well as he had to develop and learn his powers, as well as his skill sets as a hero on his own. He kind of gets himself into bad situations. He doesn't know how to balance his life with his secret identity. And you actually kind of catch this narrative with respect to paralleling it to someone like Daredevil, who, while he still runs into problems, Daredevil is still typically portrayed as being better as just kind of moonlighting as Daredevil while also being Matt Murdock, to the point that he can even have people, for the most part, know his identity and still walk away clean as Matt Murdock because nobody wants to be convinced that a blind man can kick their butt. So then we go back into the MCU. or not the MCU, but the Sonyverse. The fact that we've got this very competent Peter Parker, and then we transition into Miles Morales. So the author Brian Michael Bendis, and this is actually referenced, if you'll see Miles Morales' phone when he's on the subway kind of scrolling through, you'll see two contacts. There's a couple more, but two main ones that I picked up were Brian Michael Bendis as well as Brian B as well as Sarah P. And that's Brian Michael Bendis as well as Sarah Pichelli, who were the two co-creators of Miles Morales. Brian Michael Bendis actually being the one who started writing Ultimate Spider-Man from Peter Parker transitioning all the way into Miles Morales, with Sarah Pichelli actually taking on and writing or illustrating Miles Morales after the death of Peter Parker. So there are clearly some differences between the Sonyverse portrayal of the Ultimate Universe as well as the Marvel portrayal of the Ultimate Universe, or rather the comic portrayal of the Ultimate Universe. Because in the Ultimate Universe, what a lot of people don't realize is that Spider-Man starts off as a kid or a teenager, 13, 14, kind of having to figure out his body, go through puberty, etc. But in the true canon Marvel comics, which is this is where it gets confusing, the 616 universe, that's the main, if you've read a recent Spider-Man comic, 9 times out of 10, that's what you're reading, is the 616 universe. So, the difference there being that by the time Peter Parker gained his powers in the 616 universe, he was around 16 or 17, about to leave high school and go on to college, become a full-fledged adult. So a lot of people argue with the narrative of a teenage Spider-Man because of the fact that in the comics he was already in the 616 mainline universe, he was verging on being a man, which is why you kind of see this spun in the Tobey Maguire portrayal of Spider-Man as well as the Andrew Garfield portrayal of Spider-Man. However, when you get Tom Holland as well as the comic book Ultimate Universe version of Spider-Man, they are very much trying to capture this sense of, naivety and youth by having a younger Spider-Man, someone who is clearly in high school, clearly adolescent, and clearly learning how to master, develop their powers, and balance great power and great responsibility. So then we get back into the Sonyverse portrayal of this in the animated movie. Right, the fact that you've got this very competent Spider-Man who's got his own cereal, he's got his own Christmas album, he knows how to handle any and every threat, and no matter how hard you hit him, he just gets back up. But to be fair, that's a common theme in Spider-Man, and that's something critical to the character, is no matter how down on his luck he is, no matter how bad he's feeling, he gets back up. He keeps fighting. So then, that's where we transition into Miles Morales' story. How does he factor into things? Well, in the original 1610, the Ultimate Universe, the comics, we see Miles Morales just as a middle schooler, high schooler who gets bit by a spider. In fact, the spider was actually from Oscorp. So in the comics, in the Ultimate Universe, rather than just a random spider that bites Peter Parker, the spiders were developed by Oscorp, also known as Norman Osborn's company. And for those of you who know, Norman Osborn is the Green Goblin, or Willem Dafoe, as we saw portrayed in the Sam Raimi Spider-Man. Either way. So Norman Osborn's company creates these spiders, and one bites Peter Parker. However, you also find out that Norman Osborn had developed a goblin formula. He developed this superhuman formula that ends up turning him into the Green Goblin. However, the differentiation between the 616, the canonical Marvel universe, and the Ultimate Universe is that in the mainline Marvel universe, his transformation is more mental. Yes, he's physically stronger and faster, but he still looks like Norman Osborn and puts on a costume to become the Green Goblin. Mentally, he becomes unstable, and that's where the Green Goblin comes from in the 616 universe. However, when we get to the Ultimate Universe, we actually see a physical transformation of the Green Goblin. He gets horns, he grows taller, stronger, has green skin, and can breathe fire. He literally becomes this dragon-like creature, which gets taken to an extreme when we see it portrayed in this movie, where you've got a literal dragon with wings and everything just flying around. It's actually pretty awesome, which was something that I really enjoyed seeing in this movie, was just the different portrayals of these villains, how they were seeing Octavia, um, Dr. Olivia Octavius. So a female Doc Ock that nobody saw coming was incredible. In fact, actually, that kind of feeds into one of my favorite Spider-Man story arcs, which is the Superior Spider-Man, which is mainline 616 continuity, where Doc Ock takes over Peter Parker's body and tries to become a better Spider-Man than him. That doesn't have anything to do with this movie. I just really like that comic book run. So, back to the movie. We got to see different portrayals of these villains, but one critical element that I want to bring up is the Prowler. So in the comic, he kind of started Aaron Davis, right, in the main universe, 616. He started this enemy of Spider-Man, then began to work with him. You know, he's kind of this rogue turned ally, and even worked on technology for Peter, as well as in some of the newer comics covered for him. When Peter Parker had his own company, was running Parker Industries, while he was around the world in China or wherever, Aaron Davis, the Prowler, would wear the Spider-Man suit and cover for him in New York, just swinging around. It was kind of a cool dichotomy to see between this character we saw in the movie versus the character in this comic series, the mainline comic series. Then we get to the actual comic book version of Aaron Davis, the Prowler. He's still evil. He's still a super thief, or I don't want to say evil. Evil kind of, it puts it in black and white, you know, because people can try to do the wrong things for the right reasons, and it's clear that in each version he loves Miles very much. He's trying to do his best to be a role model or a cool uncle. He just strays from the law, or strays from the conventional sense of right and wrong, which causes friction between him and his brother, Miles' dad. Either way, in the Ultimate Comics universe, we see that he is still the Prowler, but he actually gets the spider that bites Miles Morales. So we see Miles Morales get bitten by the spider that crawls out of one of Aaron Davis's bag. While Miles is just chilling in Aaron's apartment, the Prowler's apartment, he gets bitten by a spider out of nowhere. This turns out to be the very same spider we see bite Miles in the movie. However, once again, the spiders that bit Peter Parker and Miles in the comic books are both from Oscorp. And Miles Morales isn't really portrayed in the 616, at least not yet. I mean, he has been finally integrated after the events of Secret Wars. That's a whole nother video. We're going to have to deal with that later. But, that being said, Miles Morales is now in the mainline universe, but before that, when he was still in the Ultimate Universe, him and Peter Parker were each bitten by different radioactive spiders. This showcases in the fact that Miles Morales can turn invisible as well as use a venom blast, which a lot of people think is overpowered. It kind of is, but at the same time, hey, it helped him take out Kingpin. So, we go back to Aaron Davis, and this is kind of cool that Aaron Davis is a consistent figure because of the fact that now in this movie we see that there's this parallel between Miles and Peter, each having an uncle die, that an uncle they looked up to as like this kind of pseudo father figure, right? That causes them to have a heart change, or causes them to commit more steadfastly to their cause as a hero, causes him to grow. So yeah, I just found that really poignant. I found that really just emotionally deep, is the fact that this guy, the Prowler, who's clearly a competent hitman, thief, villain in the movie, cannot bring himself to kill his nephew in front of the Kingpin. I mean, one of the baddest villains, and he knows what it's about to cost him. And even in the wake of death, in the face of death, he refuses to kill Miles. It's really beautiful. But we actually see Aaron Davis, the Prowler, portrayed in Spider-Man Homecoming. So he is in the MCU, and he's portrayed by none other than Donald Glover, aka Childish Gambino. So this actually comes about when Spider-Man's in the parking lot, and he's talking to this thief he's talking to this guy who's just at his car, webs him to the trunk of his car, and it's, Donald Glover. It's Aaron Davis, who we don't get to see in a costume or anything, but the Spider-Man Homecoming kind of alluded to several villains that weren't in costume at the time, which was nice. The main two being Mac Gargan, also known as the Scorpion, and Aaron Davis, also known as the Prowler. This is kind of expanded upon by the fact that in the deleted scenes, which typically are considered to be canon by most people, we see Aaron Davis, Childish Gambino, still stuck to his car with the web, but also calling on his phone saying, "Hey, Miles, I'm sorry I'm not going to be able to make it. which is implying that Miles Morales is in the MCU somewhere out there. So this has a lot of potential. So we go back to these spiders because, let me go back to these spiders. Once again, they're from Oscorp in the comics, but if you noticed in the film, you see that it says the number 42 on it, but also Alchemax. So Alchemax is a pretty big deal because Alchemax is actually, in the comics, we see that Alchemax is actually the company that kind of just owns everything, this evil megacorp in the future of the Marvel Universe, which happens to be the year 2099. Now, why is that so significant? At the end of the movie, if you watch the after credit scene, we see this mysterious Spider-Man in this interesting looking red and blue suit. So that happens to be Miguel O'Hara from the year 2099, this future version of New York called Nueva York, right? So he's actually the Spider-Man from the far future that gets infused with spider DNA, like half human, half spider, very confusing. And he is this futuristic version of Spider-Man from this era of comics, the Marvel, the 2099 line, which was an alternate reality until kind of being branched or converged into the mainline Marvel 616 universe. This kind of plays into that event I alluded to earlier, Secret Wars by Jonathan Hickman, where a lot of interesting different Marvel universe kind of collide and become one, so that after everything, you kind of have just one consolidated universe. That's neither here nor there. It's just a kind of a talk about how weird multiverses can be in comics. So then we kind of fast forward and we see this this Spider-Man who is kind of out of the loop of all these events, but is still able to monitor it. His AI Lila, the kind of I guess fashionable girl we see with him, who is just a hologram, is his kind of I guess personal attendant, helps develop his multi-dimensional slider or his multi-dimensional device or whatnot, which we then see him use to go visit the cartoon Spider-Man back from the original series, the original animated series. So this is interesting because it starts to allude to the event that kind of spurred all this, which in the comics is called Spider-Verse. So, dang it, this is where it gets really deep into comic lore. So let's kind of backtrack a lot. There were these vampire-like beings back around, early 2000s or mid 2000s called, well, I don't even remember, but one of them was named Moreland, right? So he's hunting Peter Parker, trying to drain his totemic energy, yada da 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 da. Long story short, Peter ends up beating him. Then we fast track to a couple years back where he comes back, but he's got kind of a crew with him, like these interdimensional vampires that are tracking down superpowered beings and trying to drain their kind of life force. It turns out in particular that these spider people have like kind of purer life force for whatever reason. That's a whole, once again, other concept. So they're tracking down different Spider-Men from different universes. It's funny because we even see these vampires track down and drain the energy, thus killing the Spider-Man from Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends. It was kind of actually really sad, man. I love that cartoon, so seeing him die in the comics was kind of brutal. Either way, once the different Spider-Men start to figure out what's going on, they start to band together to kind of try and create a council of Spider-Men within the Spider-Verse. All these Spider-Men from across different Marvel realities that need to band together to face this common threat. But the one kind of uniting them all was this one called Spider UK. So for those who are familiar with Captain Britain, he's this Captain Britain. So he's this British superhero who has this power of he can fly, he's super strong, he's got some kind of general but super powerful abilities, but they all magnify with his confidence. So the more confidence or assured he is, the more powerful he gets. So in an alternate reality, you have this kind of merging of Spider-Man and this character. So he's just this super hyper powerful Spider-Man, which is really interesting, but he was created for and in the Spider-Verse event. Gosh, okay, wow, man, comics are crazy confusing now that I think about it. So, either way, the main takeaway is that Spider UK was the one trying to go around and gather all these different Spider-Men to protect them, as well as collect them together to fight this interdimensional vampire threat. That was a lot. Let me summarize it as to why that kind of matters here. Is because we see that Spider-Man 2099, who is voiced by Oscar Isaac, who played Apocalypse in X-Men Apocalypse, as well as, well, it's Oscar Isaac. That being said, we see him portraying Spider-Man 2099, who apparently has somehow been watching the events of Into the Spider-Verse, of the movie. He sees that there are dimensional rifts. He's somehow aware of everything, and because of that, has Lila, his AI assistant, start working on this device. I mean, this his own interdimensional kind of portal, or portal device. So that's interesting because it kind of implies that Spider-Man 2099 is taking over this role of Spider UK, and that is a little bit more important. I mean, just kind of easier to adapt to because there are people who are familiar with Spider UK. I mean, not Spider UK, but Spider-Man 2099. Because once again, he came out of the 90s. It was this kind of period where Marvel was trying to do edgy reinventions, once again, of a lot of characters like Doctor Doom, Daredevil, Moon Knight, Spider-Man, Deadpool. I mean, gosh, I'm trying to think. I mean, there were a lot of them, but they were trying to reinvent them, similar to what we saw in the Ultimate Universe, but it ended up being like a different timeline. So it was very, very interesting. So my theory then is kind of that Spider-Man 2099 is taking on that role of gathering different Spider-Men because there's something happening that we don't see. And that smells like sequel potential. So I'm looking forward to that. Now, let's also get into why some people noticed that this was Spider-Man 2099 without actually knowing the history of the character. So if you've played the Spider-Man PS4 game, you'll notice there are a lot of costumes. And I mean like a lot of different costumes from different runs and different periods of Spider-Man comics. So we get a better glimpse of this when we go into the Spider Cave, I guess, where all the Spider-Man and Aunt May are meeting for the first time. So we see different costumes of various types, which is where most people happen to know these designs for different Spider-Men from. Spider-Man Noir, Spider-Man 2099. Captain Spider-Man is another one, the one with the cape. Let's see. I think that's Captain Spider-Man. There's a lot of different ones. You even have the this black and green suit, which is this tech outfitted suit that allows Peter Parker to turn invisible or deflect sound. It basically has multiple modes, and he uses it to fend off different threats. That's a key component of Peter Parker's character, is that he's a scientist at the end of the day. So it's pretty much like Batman being a detective. It's great to show Batman take out foes, but when you get into his analytical, tactical, and detective abilities, that's when you really flesh out the character. So, for Peter Parker, Spider-Man, you only capitalize on the character when you show his analytical and scientific side. This kind of earnest kid who was bitten by a spider because he was going to a science fair, and that showcases that he is smart. It's not just about fighting a threat, it's about outthinking a threat or being equipped for whatever situation he faces. It's like a Batman, but more last minute. So we get into all these different costumes, but then we get into the different Spider-Men. We already kind of discussed Miles Morales as well as the original, I guess, Peter Parker in this Ultimate Universe. But once again, the two main universes I've described are the Ultimate Universe and the mainline universe, 616. So this is interesting because when the Kingpin cranks up the Super Collider, we actually see that there are multiple different dimensional listings. There are you have, I can't even remember all the others, but there's like E-1610, E-616. So the reason why this is important is because we already know that it's implied that the universe therein is the Ultimate Universe respective to the Sonyverse. So that's 1610. Then we get into the fact that that 616 is mentioned, which would be the mainline universe, in our world, the comics we typically read. So the implication here is that the Spider-Man that we get, the kind of burnout, fat, thick, divorced, sad Spider-Man is is the main Spider-Man within the Sonyverse. that Jake Johnson, who voices this Peter B. Parker, is the main Spider-Man for that kind of section of all the Marvel properties going on, which is interesting to consider. But that also sadly plays a lot more into Peter Parker in the mainline comics kind of a history. The fact that there are a lot of odd things that have happened to Peter Parker. He was married to Mary Jane for a bit, but after Aunt May dies after Civil War, or during Civil War, in the fallout, she was assassinated because they were trying to kill Peter and they accidentally killed her. Peter Parker and Mary Jane agree to, they kind of mess that up too. They agree to annul their marriage, basically to do away with their holy matrimony before Mephisto, this dark god. Maybe y'all kind of, or this dark lord. Maybe y'all remember him from the Nick Cage Ghost Rider movies, with Nick Cage also voicing Spider-Man Noir in this film. But in any case, we see that there is this, like dark, this dark event called One More Day, or Brand New Day, or whatnot, where Peter Parker and Mary Jane divorce, and they still haven't recovered from that. I think they're kind of slightly on that path right now, but I mean, this is something that was years in the making, and it's just kind of vanished for a little over a decade at this point, and a lot of comic fans were upset about that. But hey, I mean, what more can you do? To resurrect someone from the dead, you would sacrifice your marriage, I guess, which there's a lot of weird... I'm not going to get into that. I'm just going to focus on the fact that they kind of adapt this to the fact that Aunt May dies within the Sonyverse 616 universe, and then Mary Jane and Peter split apart, and we see this Peter who, at the same time, is just unlucky, is just down on his luck, and that factors into, like, kind of the original Peter Parker. The main Peter Parker is the fact that he kind of can't get his act together. He tries to do his best, but that's also critical to the Spider-Man lore and mythos, is this character who, yeah, maybe he's not always at the top of his game. He's one of the smartest men in the world. He's one of the strongest men in the world, but at the same time, with great power comes great responsibility. So he's doing what he can, and because of what he does, there are sacrifices that he has to be made, and there are costs that are paid. So, case in point, like eating pizza on your futon and crying in a shower in your Spider-Man costume. I guess those are the costs to be paid for saving the world. So then we go into the other universes when we see the different Spider-Men. So I'm trying to remember, because we have two Peter Parkers, one from 1610 Ultimate Universe, which is voiced by Chris Pine. Then we have the Jake Johnson Peter B. Parker, which he's voiced by Jake Johnson. Then we get into the other four Spider-Men that we see. So you've got Spider-Man. So Spider-Gwen, let's see, Penny Parker, also known as Spider, or SP//DR. Then you've got Spider-Man Noir, and then you've got Spider-Ham. Alright, so let's kind of tear this down. So Spider-Gwen, also known as Spider-Woman, and more recently in the comics known as Ghost Spider, is Gwen Stacy in an alternate reality. Her reality is actually one of my favorites. Her kind of own universe or sector is one of my favorites because of the fact that she is, she's Gwen Stacy, but instead of Peter Parker getting bitten by the spider, she gets bitten by the spider. And in this universe, we see a lot of different takes on beloved characters. So Peter Parker, because he wasn't bitten, they have this kind of pseudo-romantic relationship, but instead of becoming Spider-Man, he becomes the Lizard, and he does die in a fight with Spider-Gwen, with Gwen Stacy, and because of that, she becomes kind of this vigilante, very much similar to how Spider-Man is portrayed as a vigilante or on the wrong end of the law in the comics traditionally. So Spider-Gwen kind of gains that renown because of people believing that she killed Peter Parker. This also mirrors the fact that in the mainline continuity of the 616, Peter Parker is typically attributed and associated with the death of Gwen Stacy. In a famous run, in a famous issue, or just a moment, we see the Green Goblin toss Gwen Stacy from his glider off of a bridge. Spider-Man tries to save her by casting a web, but ultimately leads to her breaking her back and neck. This is I can't remember the issue number off the top of my head, but this is largely considered to be kind of the end of the silver age of comics, this kind of more innocent period as we go into, I guess, the Bronze Age, and like a lot of darker narrative on comics, because we see a historic character just die because of such a tragic event. But this is paralleled with the fact that Gwen Stacy kind of kills Peter Parker, or leads to his death, in her own universe when she's Spider-Gwen. Now, there are other portrayals of different characters. Matt Murdock, also known as Daredevil, works for the Kingpin, and is known as Matt Murderdock, as a little... Either way. And Frank Castle actually works for the police. He's a cop with a massive vendetta against vigilantes. And Uncle Ben is still alive. And it's actually really sad, because you realize that Gwen has this huge kind of fear of facing him, because he's just this cheery old man who's, carrying on with life. Is just very loving, but is still having to deal with the loss of a son. I mean, obviously Peter's a nephew, but I mean, people seem to be in line and understand that Aunt May and Uncle Ben are very much Peter's parents. So that's kind of a harsh take, but it's a really beautiful universe. And some people kind of argue with this kind of punky portrayal. I forget the kind of trope terms they used to describe her, but people don't realize that that's how she was written. Gwen Stacy is kind of this punk rocker in the comic she was in. So she's in this band called the Mary Janes, which is led by Mary Jane, and she's in this band along with Felicia Hardy, also known as the Black Cat. So this is where we also get into interesting portrayal of characters. So she's a drummer. She's in this punk rock band. So that is very much in tone and in line with her character. Wow. Okay, and we have like 3 other Spider-Men to get through. So I'm going to kind of blow through this. Then we get to Spider-Man Noir, aka Nicolas Cage. Man, I loved his portrayal of just Spider-Man Noir. So this was another alternate universe that Marvel created, just to kind of recast, not really reinvent, but recast characters, to imagine them through the lens of kind of these pulp comics, or these like just old school 1930s, 1940s as comics, these noir detective narratives. So there's an interesting amount going on with that, because he actually gets his powers like kind of magically, like an artifact breaks open and he gets his spider powers. And he's actually taught a different lesson by Uncle Ben in these comics, which is, rather than with great power comes great responsibility, is that when someone has too much power, it's the responsibility of others to take it away, or something of something of that nature. I probably butchered it. Either way, this is also an interesting take, because they didn't really capitalize on it or portray it in the movie, but Spider-Man Noir also typically carries a gun with him, so he is more of a lethal Spider-Man, which is also counterintuitive, or a step or deviation from what we typically associate with Spider-Man and being non-lethal. Then let's go ahead and go into Spider-Ham. Okay, Spider-Ham's voiced by John Mulaney, who's a great comedian, he killed it on the role as well. I mean, all the voice actors, the VAs for these guys did incredible. But Spider-Ham is, I try explaining this and I can't do it without like just wanting to hit my head against the wall, because Spider-Ham is a spider that was bitten by this scientist, this radioactive, who made herself radioactive and bit the spider. So then he transformed into this pig because of the radiation, with the abilities of a pig and a spider. And then this female pig scientist who bit him went insane and believed that she was his aunt, his Aunt May. And the spider who became a pig adopted the identity of Peter Porker. Gosh, that every time, like, just even explaining that now is kind of mind-numbing. Either way, that's why I love comics. So that is the origin story of Peter Porker. Spider-Ham, we get it was kind of done as a one-shot. It was kind of done as like a half joke when they published it, and then it kind of gained traction, which is actually kind of how you see 2 of these Spider-Men come to light, right? Is Gwen Stacy and Penny Parker, or Spider-Gwen and Spider, or Penny Parker characters came out of the Edge of the Spider-Verse. So I talked about the Spider-Verse event earlier, but the Edge of the Spider-Verse was a series of 5 comics that came out, kind of introducing new and different Spider-Men that were introduced solely for these comics. One of them included One of them included a scientist who was kind of this darker Spider-Man who was using his abilities for his own gain. One of them was this more monstrous Spider-Man who was Peter Parker, but kind of his mutation went wrong, right? Rather than staying human and having spider abilities, he became more animal-like, more spider-like. Gosh, I'm trying to remember because I know I'm forgetting one of them. There's 5 in total, but the 2 that I was focusing on rather were Spider-Gwen, who I just described, and then Penny Parker. So the reason why I actually saved Penny Parker for last is because she's actually like my favorite. She's my favorite Spider-Man, like one of my favorite Spider-Men, because of her origin story and because of kind of how the comic was done. It was really well done. So for those of you who may not be aware of this, Gerard Way. Actually, let me backpedal. For those of you who may be familiar with the band My Chemical Romance, the lead singer's name is Gerard Way. So it turns out Gerard Way is a huge comic and anime fan. And I mean that to the fact that he publishes comics and has written comics. So under Dark Horse, a publisher, he wrote and published this comic that is actually getting a Netflix adaptation called Umbrella Academy. He did that. It was very kind of cult famous, but also it took off and got pretty popular because it lampooned and serialized, but also put the pedal to the metal on a lot of comic book elements. It gets interesting. You've got these 8 or 9 kids who get adopted by this weird old man who wants to raise these kids to protect the world against threats that most people can't handle, to rip off the X-Men, but that's kind of the point. Either way, you fast forward, he writes a decent amount of comics, and then he actually gets hired by DC to run a imprint of theirs, which an imprint is pretty much just a sub-label, but an imprint of theirs called Young Animal, to kind of revitalize a new band. So yeah, he works and writes for DC right now. So he's the guy writing Doom Patrol right now. So for those of you watching the Titans series by DC or streaming on DC, you'll get kind of introduced to the Doom Patrol because they're critical to Beast Boy's backstory, and that's also in the Teen Titans animated series. So yeah, he's writing Doom Patrol right now, which is like just an interesting connection. That being said, he also wrote this Penny Parker character, this spider character. So Penny Parker's father dies in battle, right while piloting in the spider suit, because technically she doesn't actually have abilities on her own. And this is where I get to make a Pacific Rim reference, which is awesome. So you've got this spider mech, this robot that is piloted to protect the city. However, it can only be piloted if you have this synchronicity, this just kind of communication and collaboration between a pilot and then a radioactive spider who mentally link and then pilot the robot together. It's a really interesting concept. It's just like Pacific Rim, where you need 2 minds to pilot one giant robot. But it's interesting because the spider mech it's barely larger than a human. I mean, it's like maybe 8 to 10 feet tall, which is cool. But in that comic, you get to be briefly introduced to Daredevil as well as Mysterio, which take on very interesting appearances, and that's honestly, it's just pretty cool. I love the whole aesthetic, especially because if you're an anime fan, there's a lot of deep cut, well, not really deep cut references, but you've got references to traditional anime and like big anime such as Neon Genesis Evangelion. You've got Akira, you've got Ghost in the Shell. Gerard Way clearly did it with like a lot of love, and the other authors and artists on the project. So I really love that. That's where my kind of problem with the portrayal of Penny Parker is, because she's portrayed as a little bit more lighthearted than I cared to go. Because this one is in the comic, in the Edge of Spider-Verse comic, she's a little bit darker, right? It's kind of this narrative of like this girl having to pick up the pieces after her father's death and learn how to defend the city. Traditional Spider-Man narrative. So I've got very mixed feelings on her portrayal in Into the Spider-Verse. In fact, one thing that Sean and I talked about, and there's a link to our spoiler-free review, our spoiler review together in the comment section or in the details, is that there was it felt like there was that she was kind of functionally worthless after her mech got destroyed, which is honestly a sad truth of that is for people who watch mecha anime or they like enjoy like just giant robot fights. That's kind of the state and claim of how it works. Is once your robot gets destroyed, you're donezo. It's very rare that like someone like that you have a pilot or someone who has a giant robot who's like able to fight on their own. Which, if you've watched the TV show or anime Gurren Lagann, you would understand that Lord Genome, the big bad for the first season, is fully capable of that. Wow, that's a mouthful. So either way, she kind of becomes functionally worthless right after she gets her mech torn apart, and then it seems like she has this weird emotional attachment to her robot that isn't really explained or expounded upon, and because it's just her and the spider. Like, why would she be connected to this robot? Then it occurred to me that was her father's robot. So that was kind of the last, I guess, semblance or the last remnants of her father that just got destroyed trying to save the multiverse. So that was her kind of parting with and letting go of this piece of her past. And yeah, that could have been capitalized on a little bit better, but it's something that you got to kind of look past and think about for a couple of seconds before it clicks, or at least for me. But those are the 5 Spider-Men. There's other Easter eggs in there. Those were the ones that I kind of was picking up, just like talking about the 5 different Spider-Men and the different costumes. Also, just kind of varying levels of competency between Spider-Men. So yeah, once again, this is a different take on the Ultimate Universe because the Ultimate Universe Spider-Man is supposed to be less competent than the 616 Spider-Man because he's a kid, he's a teenager. In fact, in the 1610, the Ultimate Universe, one thing that they did do correctly was the fact that Peter Parker does die in that universe, which is why Miles Morales has to take up the mantle as Spider-Man. So this comes into play because of the fact that Peter Parker finally battles against the Green Goblin for the last time, and actually during kind of this series of events, the Punisher tries to snipe Captain America, and Peter Parker dives in the way to protect him from a bullet. So it's kind of implied that the only reason that Peter Parker died from his injuries fighting the Green Goblin was because he had taken a bullet for Captain America, which you see in the fallout of Peter Parker's death, and this is in the comics, the Ultimate Comics. You see in the fallout of Peter Parker's death that Captain America blames himself for Peter Parker's death, but Nick Fury does as well for not training and equipping Peter Parker better, so that he could be able to face villains like the Green Goblin. Because another element of the Spider-Man mythos is the fact that most Spider-Men are self-taught. Like, they have to rise to the they have to rise to the occasion. They're not trained. There is actually a Spider-Man. I'm trying to think canonically. Actually, there's technically 2 that I can think of who are better at analyzing and utilizing their powers just because of their prowess or their training. And that would be the Superior Spider-Man, aka Doc Ock, who uses science to kind of analyze and capitalize on his powers a lot more, as well as, I want to say the Earth X Spider-Man. I can't remember directly the universe off the top of my head, but it's a Spider-Man who joins S.H.I.E.L.D. early on and becomes like an assailant as well as just a shadow agent, like a black op, and is able to, is just stronger, faster, but also has his spider sense is so honed that it becomes precognitive, so he can pretty much see the future, or at least like a couple minutes, couple seconds out, rather than just reacting in a snap, like at a last minute. That was just interesting. So that's also where the movie deviates, right? Is while Peter Parker still dies, he dies at the hands of the Kingpin rather than the Green Goblin, or his injuries fighting the Green Goblin. Because ultimately, he does protect his family and New York from the Green Goblin, Norman Osborn. And that's also interesting now that I think about it. We never got to see Norman Osborn in the film. We only saw his Green Goblin form, which actually is voiced by Jorma Taccone, I think, of The Lonely Island. That's neither here nor there. I just thought it was cool. But we see Kingpin kill him. And that was also interesting to witness Kingpin kill him, because they also stuck to this comic book element that Kingpin is just strong. I mean, it's like unnaturally strong. He's a formidable Daredevil villain because a lot of people don't realize that Kingpin isn't just strong, but he's also, trained on par with most ninja as well as martial artists. once again, it's a very weird concept because, he's kind of a bulkier villain, but he's strong, agile, and skilled, far beyond what you would expect, especially because he's kind of this evil mega mind businessman kind of guy. We also see a couple references to other Spider-Man villains, right? So I'm trying to think, because we see that we see Tombstone, Lonnie Lincoln, is with him with him the whole time, with Kingpin the whole time, and Lonnie Lincoln's kind of got an interesting backstory because of the fact that he doesn't actually require oxygen. That's why he's called Tombstone, because he's technically dead. He doesn't require oxygen. That's why his skin is blue. He's also like kind of this crime boss who sometimes works with the Kingpin, but also sometimes has to do tries to do his own thing. It was also weird and interesting because while he has a fair bit of interaction with Spider-Man and the Spider-Man mythos and lore, he was kind of the big bad or the huge villain of the James Asmus Gambit run a couple years back, and I actually liked that run. But yeah, so Gambit, the X-Men, was interacting with and facing Tombstone. But we also see kind of references to villains such as Hammerhead, who is another crime boss, mob boss, but who, as the name would imply, has a just thick, massive forehead, more like a 5-head. Am I right? That was terrible. But yeah, so he just has a massive, just strong head, and can just tear people apart with it, or rather break bones with it, which is honestly a pretty stupid ability when you think about it, because either way, comics. But actually, in a Spider-Man run, he gets his skeleton, similar to Wolverine, laced with adamantium by Mr. Negative. So for those who, once again, played the Spider-Man PS4 game and are familiar with Mr. Negative and his ability to bankroll as well as superpower criminals, he takes Hammerhead and laces his skeleton with adamantium so that his skull, his spine, etc. are unbreakable. However, Spider-Man realizes that he didn't lace his legs or line his legs with adamantium. So while Hammerhead is trying to take down a bus full of children in order to draw out and fight Spider-Man, Spidey just breaks his legs. It's pretty brutal and awesome, but once again, also kind of messed up. So we see references to him. There's a lot more references in the film. I'm sure I haven't caught it. I've only seen it twice, so there's a lot more I need to pick up. I caught elements like the fact that the artist John Romita, John Romita Sr. and John Romita Jr., both who have worked for Marvel, as well as John Romita Jr. at least has worked for DC, and John Romita Jr. is the one who drew Kick-Ass, illustrated Kick-Ass alongside with Mark Miller as the writer. So that being said, I mean, there were a lot of references I'm sure I missed. I'm trying to actually think of several. We saw the Stan Lee cameo where he's in the where he's in the costume shop, and this was a reference to Miles Morales actually trying to use just a Spider-Man Halloween costume in order to, I guess, parade around as Spider-Man for the first time. And actually, there is a funny bit of an exchange just because when he's jumping around as Spider-Man, you can clearly see the skin. So someone remarks that he's, either way, they kind of remark on his race because they're just confused about him, and it's pretty interesting just to see how Miles Morales' race also kind of turns and inverts the Spider-Man lore on its head because of his mixed background as Black American as well as Latino American. It's really cool. But we also get into another Latino American who is, once again, Miguel O'Hara, who we see in the far future. And I'm only bringing him up again because since we're talking about Spider-Man costumes, his costume isn't actually like a uniform. There's nothing inherently special about it with respect to his own timeline. So once he discovers that he's Spider-Man, he realizes that, he has spider abilities. He realizes he can project claws from his fingers, talons, with venom, etc. So he needs a way to, he's obviously going to tear through his clothes. So he realizes he has a costume, a Day of the Dead costume, just in his closet that he uses, and it's made of unstable molecules, which the Fantastic Four use frequently for their costumes because unstable molecules can just morph and adapt to people's powers and their physiological states, which is why Johnny Storm doesn't burn his costume. The Thing can wear any size pants. Dr. Reed can stretch to any size, and Susan Storm can turn invisible. So he has just a Day of the Dead Dia de los Muertos costume made out of unstable molecules. So he wears that to fight crime as Spider-Man 2099 because it allows him to not tear the costume apart when he uses his claws. This is kind of retroactively addressed, I guess, when in the let's see, Spider-Man run a couple backs where he come a couple years back, where he is in the mainline continuity, but he gets an actual upgraded suit that has technology inside of it that allows him to integrate fully with his digital assistant Lila, as well as gives him certain other abilities and nuances, and has added armor. So once again, that was kind of an interesting note, but the main takeaway is the fact that Into the Spider-Verse was awesome. I think it's legitimately my favorite Spider-Man film so far, just because of how ambitious it was and because of just the level of emotion and heart put into it, despite how just over the top the plot as well as just everything going on was. And then whatever awaits in the future, the sequel potential for this is amazing. I mean, the literal concept of there being other Spider-Men out there, like one of my other favorites is Spider-Punk, who's this anarchistic punk in this kind of dystopian, totalitarian alternate universe, or even Spider-Zombie, Whedon or Zombie Spider-Man. It's literally up in the air where Sony could go with this, because they've already announced they've got sequels, or at least a sequel, and spin-offs planned. So I can't wait to see where it goes. Whew, and that is my spoiler review for Into the Spider-Verse. I loved it. I encourage you to see it. I am sorry that I have rambled on for so long, but it was just a good film. So if I'm rambling on too long, if I'm not hitting on critical points, or maybe I missed something, please drop a line down below. Leave some feedback or suggestions. I'd love to hear what you have to say, or maybe you just want some Spider-Man run recommendations. If you like this video or you like what I'm talking about, please hit the like button. And if you really liked what I'm talking about, please hit the subscribe button. I'd love to get some more feedback, as well as tailor some more content to y'all. And I know it's just fun talking comics, y'all. So please stay posted for some new content, and thank you for joining me for another episode of King's Comics.